if you have a keyword that you're trying to target as hard as possible, keep close keyword matches to that, right? One page for that, one entity, and then by keeping that page so focused, you're not going to run into keyword cannibalization issues, which is kind of what we're talking about, like entity cannibalization or keyword cannibalization. It's very similar.
So also, I mean, there's the whole entity concept. I think we discussed before we started recording around using entities with like Google Trends and maybe page content. How does that all apply into here? It doesn't.
Okay, so a little bit of Google history. There used to be a company called Freebase, which had the knowledge graph of the time, and then they were bought up by Google, and then that was absorbed and merged. So actually, most entities that we see today are still Freebase, and you can tell because if you do an entity-based search into Google, there's going to be a piece of URL structure into it, but it's going to say /m/. And that basically indicates this is a Freebase entity that we imported.
All right.
And you can do the same thing with Google Trends. So Google Trends, generally, you have to look at 2 trends for any term. One has to be the entity and one has to be the search term. If you're not doing that, then you're not getting like a true representation because the searches are being split for a certain thing.
Can you give an example? Searching for bicycle again, maybe?
That's a perfect example. So a Peloton is both a French word for a group of riders, which could come up during the Tour de France, right? Or a Peloton is the company. And so there's like some real search confusion going on with that term. If you look at that search results page, it's like, here's a definition for Peloton, here's a picture of the product. They're having to compete with this entity without realizing that by going into that brand name, they were fighting with that entity.
It's interesting because I do a lot of following of the term Bing because I write about Bing.
Uh-huh.
But there's a mayor, or was a mayor, I don't think it's a mayor, Mayor Bing. Maybe Chicago, somewhere in the Midwest. I could be completely wrong and you could tell me in the comments and so forth, but yeah, he's like a mayor. So I always see Google Trends for both Microsoft Bing and for the Mayor Bing. And I think Google understands the difference, obviously, but how does that relate to, in terms of understanding that in Google Trends? Why is that important for matching those IDs? Are the IDs going to be different? If you see Bing for Mayor versus Bing for...
Yeah.
You would see different IDs.
Those are different entity IDs.
Okay.
The other weird thing about that is when you hit the entity API that Google provides, they'll give you like basically a fuzzy match of everything they think you meant. It's sort of like the autofill, and it's going to be like, you know, this is the thing that we're 91% confident that you meant, but here's like 5 other things down to like 70% that you could have meant.
Interesting. So technically you could probably plug some of those variables into this API and see how confident Google is in terms of your content, the words you're using on a page, that it's related to actually what you want to rank for. At some level.
Yeah, with like pairing entity extraction with their...
It seems kind of overkill to apply for clients, but I guess if you automate it in some way and you have lots of clients, maybe it's useful.
There's plenty of good tools out there that are trying to do like entity content kind of mapping.
Links, I think is new. You ever see that? Dixon Jones?
Yes.
Links?
I was talking about like Phrase or Content Harmony, like content brief kind of products. Yes. Oh no, I'm missing an important one. Help me out. MarketMuse.
MarketMuse, okay.
By the way, MarketMuse just came out with a free version, so just pitching them.
Affiliate code below?
Yeah. We've been doing a weekly, like 1-hour Twitter Spaces with Jeff Coyle, Chris Ruby from Ruby Media, and then myself and Garrett Sussman at iPullRank.
Yeah.
So I need to pitch their product, otherwise they'll yell at me at our Wednesday.
Might as well, yeah. Cool, awesome. All right, so let's move on to some of the programmatic stuff. So Python, JavaScript. One of the best, most well-known SEOs in the Python space is obviously the late Hamlet.
Yeah.
I actually interviewed him at Technical Boost, Technical SEO, what's the conference
Tech
called?
SEO Boost?
Tech SEO Boost. I always get that, mix up the name, order of the names. Apologize, Paul. So you're pretty good at this Python SEO stuff. Like, what does it mean? Meaning it's making programmatic SEO.
So there's instances where I could use Screaming Frog, but I want just like a specific result. And so I'll just like build a crawler really quick to go do some work. And I have just random scripts laying around. So let's say then that I want to expand on some like URL data, go hit like the SEMrush API, let's say, get some quick data for that. I could use URL Profiler, or I could just like chain a couple of scripts together and then get like the exact result that I'm looking for. So it just takes some like manual copy. Basically anything that could be copy and pasted, I'm replacing it.
Right. I mean, that's any true developer to their core. It's all about what am I doing that I could program and save myself time.
Yeah, and Python's so good at that.
So how does somebody get started? Like if they don't really know programming that well, how do they get started? I mean, I think that's why Python's great, because it's easy to learn maybe.
It's easy to learn, although it's hard to, like a lot of people say start with C if you're becoming a developer, because then you learn weird stuff like heap management, memory. If you're in Java, then you're learning about like garbage collection, basically like memory stuff.
Right.
Python, there's none of that. It just runs. It just goes and does its thing.
So where's a good place to get started with that?
Where you get started, I would say try to solve a problem for yourself that's simple. You can go through some of these like Code Academy kind of things, but they're going to take you on a bit of a journey that isn't going to teach you like the specific libraries that you need. So JC, I'm going to butcher his name a little bit, Chouinard, that has some good tutorials.
Okay.
Or J.R. Oaks.
J.R. Oaks.
So I would look for some SEO specific tasks to complete, because you're going to learn a lot more about the exact thing that you want to complete, instead of just sort of jumping around on whatever like Code Academy type lessons.
Okay, cool. What was the latest thing you actually did, coded with Python for SEO purposes? You spill the beans?
That's a good question. I have a bad memory, so
whatever comes to mind.
Title tags, right? Immediately after that, those changes started coming through. I was like, okay, we can check this. Like, just check the SERP results. There's APIs for SEO out there, and then we just crawl the page, compare the two. We can do that at scale, and so like I could just go check a client and say, hey, out of 1,000 pages, 5% are changing, and this is what they generally look like.
Do you remember the percentages? What was the percentage that you noticed?
So
was it like 90% using the title, or was it like a lot less?
I saw 5% change rate, and then following their announcement that they had stepped it back a little bit, it was 2%.
Interesting.
And this was for a specific large client who had optimized, right? So it didn't necessarily not line up with their like 80% kind of original statement.
Was that like 2%, whatever that ended up being? Was that like really poor titles?
No, it was totally random.
Were they bad? I mean, did the click-through rate like significantly drop?
No.
So you think SEOs like real? I think SEOs are kind of like making a big deal out of it when they probably should. I saw really, really bad examples, but I think those are like just easy to point at. What?
Yeah, cherry-picked.
Cherry-picked, of course, yeah.
Yeah. No.
But overall, I mean, across all your clients, it wasn't a huge deal, right?
No.
That's what I thought.
It's annoying, but no.
Right, you want to be able to control it, but I felt like any change Google makes like that, SEOs are always going to complain. But I thought it was a little bit overblown.
One bad example that I saw was Amazon was including their search filters in their H1 tag.
Uh-huh.
So they were getting some of those in their SERPs, but also they shouldn't have done that in the first place.
Right.
So that was an easy fix.
For sure. Okay, cool. All right, so what I find often is, since we're talking about, job Python and teaching yourself, coding and stuff like that, what I find that often is that SEOs come from like two batches. One is the marketing side, and the other is the developer side. Mm-hmm. I think Mike came from the developer side, if I'm correct me
Yes, wrong. He used to work at Microsoft, actually.
Okay, so, and I know a lot of developers come from the developer side, and a lot of developers come from the marketing side, and they're just content developers and build out marketing campaigns. Both are amazing. It's always the fight, what's better, technical SEO or content SEO, or back in the day, we used to be like links or content. It was rarely about technical SEO back then, but I digress. Anyway, how do you, I have lots of development company, Rusty Brick, we do development, I don't do SEO. I don't sell SEO, so there's no conflict of interest here. Tell Mike. sure. He knows. And I'm not trying to hire. We should take a selfie after this and say, Mike, look who I'm with. And then he probably knows, but he might not know. I'll say who I'm with and
no, he was like, cool, you need to do this. And I was like, okay.
All right, cool. Well, it's going well. The question is, most of my developers don't know SEO. We work on back-end stuff sometimes. And whenever there's like a front-facing thing, I'm like, read this Google Doc, this help doc. This is how it should work on the front end to make sure it's like being indexed and there's paywall content, make sure you're using the paywall API and stuff like that. And they can pick it up very quickly. So how do you like what's like the process of like telling developers and communicating with developers in terms of like SEO concerns and stuff like that?
Yeah, so weirdly enough, some of the most advanced developers or the most SEO advanced developers out there are the ones who are working with React, because someone has come in, heavily complained, and then they had to implement SSR, right, server-side rendering, and then they also had to install React Helmet onto the site so that way people could edit meta tags and stuff.
Right.
So they like were forcefully introduced into the field. It's the sort of more old school like PHP developers who are creating custom things where they don't know as much. And so for them to sort of introduce them to the idea, basically it's a good idea to run things as tests, right? If you can validate things with them and say, here's where the traffic was, here's a small thing that we can implement to test this, start in a direction, and then we can show you the result. And then also if you can do some sort of like benefit analysis. And a lot of this comes down to understanding how much something costs for a developer, whether that's money or their just personal time. Like, you know, they probably have a list of tasks that they're addressing one sprint at a time. And so understanding to say like, hey, this should cut the line in your sprints and it's only going to take you one sprint because here's the steps that need to happen. Then they can be like, okay, I see the value. I understand why it needs to jump in line. And then so that's how you can sort of start getting developers on board with SEO. And then they just sort of learn as they go, right? You know, hand off documents like you said. But you kind of have to advocate for them because they might not necessarily advocate for themselves. And then that's how you make friends within the engineering department.
Right. I know people used to like take them out for dinners or buy them, you know, donuts or get them new tech toys just to convince them.
Engineers don't want to socialize. Don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Just give them more. Yeah. Just give them more freedom. What they said, the ultimate thing that works the best is to convince them without convincing them that what they're doing actually has the biggest bang for their buck.
If they feel good about what they're doing, or if they're like excited by the novelty of it, it'll just be like everything else is out the window.
Yeah.
You know.
Make it their idea, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like, this is not my idea, this is your idea, this is what you want to do, and somehow can tell them that way. And if it's their idea, they want to program it, for sure. Have you ever run into a situation where like, because obviously you're a developer, I assume, so ever run into a situation where you're talking to a consultant and a company, one of your clients maybe, and they're like, no, my developers don't want to do that, and you like kind of butt heads with them, and like, well, I'm a developer, they should do it. How do you deal with that, or you don't?
There's usually other low-hanging fruit. Like I don't necessarily butt heads on that. I add it to the list of tasks and then we do an implementation audit after the fact and basically say this was unimplemented and here's the sort of the loss of not implementing that, right? We try to estimate like an effort and impact of everything. And so we could say, hey, this was like, you said this was too much effort. So here's the loss of that impact.
Interesting.
Of course, some of it's guessing because it's SEO and like you're passing everything that you pass through is like a function of Google's black box.
Right.
So
that's the beauty, and also that's why I never wanted to do SEO, because it's when it comes to development, you have a spec, you build it, right?
Yes.
You know what to deliver. With SEO, ultimately is to get more traffic to the website, and sometimes you can implement the most beautiful SEO stuff, and Google's like, I'm not going to rank that. I'm sorry. I mean, that happens. I mean,
listen, you just don't have enough backlinks, but don't buy any. But you don't have enough.
For sure.